Hey all, hope all is well. It's another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 2 game from the Marshall Premier. Now, if you followed the round 1 video, you know that I won my first round game in relatively quick fashion against an untitled player, and while it was nice to get that win under my belt, I knew that the games and the opponents would get tougher. And to my surprise, in round 2, I was actually already playing up. So I was actually paired against Grandmaster Paragua, who has been a staple on the New York City chess scene for, I want to say, nearly a decade now. He originally is from the Philippines and has had a really illustrious chess career. In fact, I was speaking to him the other day at an event, and he actually was 26-30 or 26-20 at the age of 18. So he was obviously one of the greatest talents that ever came out of the Philippines, and has had quite the career. Played in a lot of tough games that really mattered, and so it was really always a tough challenge to play him. But he's been living and working in New York now for many years, and I've played him many times before, and I've had my share of ups and downs. So always a tough game. Now, I was black in this one, so it was definitely going to be even tougher because when you're playing black, you are starting at a little disadvantage. So, I was just hoping to play relatively solid and then take my chances if and when they came. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, Mark opened with d4, which is typical for him. He's typically a queen pawn type of player, or a non-e4 player, I should say. A lot of the games against him, he's played knight f3 or c4 or d4, so was not a huge surprise for me. And I went e6, actually, which is a kind of a funky move order, but early in the year, I had been playing a lot of French defenses, and so the e6 move kind of invites white to actually switch to playing an e4 opening, and also gives me a little bit of transposition power from the standpoint that I could theoretically go for a Dutch or play some other move on move 2 that isn't knight f6 because of the e6 move order. The other thing about starting with e6 is that I do avoid the Trumpowski. So, typically, black players might go knight f6 against d4, but then at least you allow bishop g5. And I do believe that Trumpowski is something in Mark's repertoire, so that's another reason why e6 is a legitimate move. After e6, Mark played knight f3. And now I went knight f6, and here c4 is played. And now I went d5, kind of going into Queen's Gambit declined territory. Now, it could transpose still to a semi-Slav. I always like to call this move order, knight f6, e6, d5, the Anand move order, because it's the one that he always took to go into semi-Slavs with c6 next, or even to play against Catalans. He always thought the move order that he preferred was knight f6, e6, and d5, the first 3 moves. And I tend to agree that it's a very, good and stable move order that also gives you a lot of transposition power, because you can also go bishop b4 check, you can go c6, you can go for, even a semi-Tarrasch or a Tarrasch with c5, you can go for Rogozin with d takes c4, and if they go knight c3, then that'd be Rogozin with bishop b4, but if you go d takes c4 after knight c3, it's actually a Vienna. So actually, this move order also gives you the most flexibility possible against white setups. So anyways, after d5, bishop g5 was played, and this was actually a little bit of a surprise for me. I kind of expected him to probably go for a Catalan or for a knight c3 variation. And actually, I didn't have a lot of experience playing against bishop g5. And one of the things I originally was asking myself was whether I can take on c4 right away, because he didn't protect the pawn. And I thought maybe there's some possibility that I could hang on to it. Now, typically, that would not be the case. Like if knight c3 was played, d takes c4 is a line in the Vienna, but you don't really get to keep the pawn on c4 typically, because black can play b5 at any moment, black can't play b5 because the knight is covering the square. So if e3 or e4, white recovers the pawn pretty quickly. Whereas now I was thinking, well, with bishop g5, after d takes c4, if he plays e3 or e4, I actually have b5 to kind of protect that pawn right away and reinforce my center. Now, in the end, I decided against it just because I did not have any, specific preparation against it, and the positions I'd be very, very unfamiliar with. So I thought it was better to go towards territory that I understood better. And that's why I went for the more modest-looking bishop to e7. Bishop e7 is really the most solid move you can make. It's really taking it into like Queen's Gambit decline territory. And yeah, it's just a very, very reliable move. You're just getting ready to castle. You're not trying to liven up the position in any way until you finish your development. And that's kind of what I was angling for. Again, I'm playing a pretty good GM, so I don't want to do anything too crazy that really takes me out of my comfort zone too early. I'd rather just kind of get the comfort of having my pieces developed and then make a critical decision. So, anyways, after bishop e7, white played knight c3, which is normal. Again, taking on c4 here doesn't make a whole lot of sense, specifically now because I can't really follow up with b5. And so here I actually played castles, which is normal in this position. And after e3, now we're nearly getting into that Queen's Gambit decline territory that we tend to get with bishop e7 and knight f6. And here I actually played h6. And this was actually turned out to be the first critical point in the game because this is the first moment where white really has to make a decision about how to determine their setup. So there are really two moves in this position. There's bishop h4 and bishop takes f6. And the most common move by far is actually bishop h4, just keeping the pressure on this diagonal and keeping the tension. And in some variations, even arguing that the h6 move might be a hook for the white pieces if they want to attack with g4 and g5. But typically here, after h4, now black gets to choose the variation, whether they want to go for a Queen's Gambit declined Tartakower variation or Queen's Gambit declined Lasker variation. I'll show you what each of those actually entail. So if you go b6, this is the Tartakower, and the idea is to put the bishop on b7, the knight on d7, and to play c5. And this is a line that I actually played once this year in the Road to Grandmaster series against an untitled player by the name of Davis Zong. And so definitely check out that game if you're curious about it, because in that game I did go for the Tartakower. I played a quick c5 and actually got a nice position. The Tartakower variation is definitely a little bit more combative because you keep more pieces on the board. The other line that you could play in this setup is actually knight e4. And this move actually is the Lasker variation. And the idea behind it is actually you basically encourage a series of exchanges, of basically trading a few pairs of minor pieces so that your space disadvantage is nullified to a certain extent, and you have a really solid setup. So typically here, bishop e7 is played because the bishop was under fire. Queen takes e7. Rook c1 is usually a move. And then after c6, black is eventually going to trade this knight on c3 and have a quite compact structure. And so something like this typically happens. And then black, depending on what white plays, either goes for the c5 break or the e5 break. So if white castles, typically e5 is the move that you want to make because it's available to you. And if white plays bishop d3, note that now e5 is also probably the move in a lot of positions because you don't get to play b6 because the c6 pawn is hanging. So actually, I should say that if castles is played, black could play b6 now and actually play bishop b7 and then play c5 as instead of e5. So typically black gets in one of those breaks and hopes that it's enough to equalize and essentially get the rooks connected. And there are many very, very reliable results for black in these setups, particularly in the Lasker variation. Perhaps the most famous or high-profile game in the Lasker variation is one that was played in the last game of the World Championship match between Vishy Anand and Veselin Topalov. Topalov was actually white, and the match was tied, and so many people were thinking, oh, it's just going to go to tie breaks, to rapid tie breaks. But actually, Anand won a game in the Lasker variation with black in the final game of the match, and so it didn't go to rapid, and he just won the match. And it was a huge stunner to win a game with black in this type of position, but Topalov pushed the envelope a little bit too much, and Anand counterattacked brilliantly. And I think that's actually one of the other themes of the Lasker variation that's kind of underrated, is a lot of white players are quite frustrated with the the kind of solidity of black structure and tries to lash out a little bit irrationally at times, and it actually gives black really great counterattacking chances and a chance to actually win the game. And so that's what happened in the non-Topolov game, and it's something that, tends to happen in this variation if white, pushes the envelope a little bit too much. But instead of playing bishop h4 and going for one of those lines that I just showed, Mark actually played bishop takes f6. And this move is quite an interesting one, because after bishop takes f6, white is really basically saying, I'm going to give up the bishop pair and essentially give up the long-term trump to get some short-term initiative. So I understood now with bishop takes f6 that Mark was probably not going to play in any type of excuse me, I'm coughing here. I'm going to take a sip of tea. Okay, so Mark isn't necessarily trying to play with any short-term plans or any long-term plans, but instead is playing with short-term plans and is going to try and get the ball rolling with some quick initiative. And so I knew already I need to be very, very alert. And right away after bishop takes f6, Mark played the move queen b3, which already puts pressure on my center, and specifically the d5 pawn. And so with this early foray with the queen, he's putting that pressure on, and it would seem that he's actually entertaining castling queenside in some lines. And here I already understood that he was going to try and make the game pretty sharp, because this is not the most usual setup. The other thing here is that because I've played h6, I have created a hook on the king side, so there could be some scenario where g4, g5 becomes an idea, and I was already a little bit, wary, or at least aware of the potential of that actually happening. So the first question for me after queen b3 was, well, what do I do with this pawn on d5? I basically had two candidates. I could defend with c6, or I could take with c4. I thought that taking on c4 didn't make a lot of sense, because after bishop takes c4, I just thought I'm helping white develop, and I didn't see the c5 break actually working out for me too well. There were lines where I was thinking maybe I could break with c5 very quickly, but I decided against it, because after d takes c5, even if I recover the pawn with something like queen a5, I thought this would basically lead to a position where I'd be slightly worse, because white always has knight e4, forking my bishop on f6 and my queen on c5. So I didn't think that was such a great idea. So instead, I decided to just reinforce the pawn with c6. Now, this move is a little bit not in the vein of the Queen's Gambit declined, simply because typically black is actually trying to play for the c5 break, and now because I have to reinforce the d5 pawn, that's not exactly happening. So unfortunately, my bishop on c8 seems like it's going to be dormant for some time, and that's maybe another advantage for white in this position where he gave up the bishop pair, because now e5 is not particularly realistic, nor is c5, as long as there's a tension on the d5 pawn. So yeah, interesting. So in some sense, the triangle pawn formation almost resembles more of a semi-Slav than a Queen's Gambit declined. And already I was trying to think of the similarities between this particular setup and the one that happens in the Moscow variation of the semi-Slav, where black actually gets the bishop pair with the bishop takes f6, and usually in that version, the queen is on f6 instead of the bishop. And I thought here that perhaps this is a slightly better version for me, because my queen becomes a little bit vulnerable on f6, and here my bishop is already a little bit better than I think the queen would be on that square. So anyways, after c6, white played h4, and already you could see here that Mark has really, really aggressive intentions, and is not planning on castling kingside. So the idea, simply put, is h4, g4, and g5, kind of prying open the h file and getting some initiative on my king. And it's actually very, very dangerous to deal with. Now, I played the move knight d7 really quickly, but right after I played it, I thought that maybe this was a move I could actually come to regret, because it seems like I'm inviting the move g4 with tempo. And this was something that really, really concerned me, because now g5, I thought, even at the cost of a pawn, might be a very, very interesting sacrifice just to open lines for the white rooks. I would assume the A rook would eventually land on g1. And yeah, I thought it'd be very dangerous, but it actually turns out that knight d7 is actually fully playable. But instead, maybe the safer move would have just been to go g6. And the point is that now if g4 is played, I can go bishop g7. And now the files will be closed, because no matter which lever white uses to try to break open the position, I'm going to basically juke him. So if he goes for g5, I'm going to go h5. And if h5 is played, then I'll go g5. And at least I keep the files closed for the time being. So I thought that was something that was probably a little bit more responsible than rushing with knight d7, because now after g4 I was like, oh my gosh, the files are going to be open no matter what, and I got very concerned. Now in this position, it appears my position is still fully playable after knight d7 and g4, but it's, again, just very, very difficult, I think, for a human to cope with, because the move that the computer suggests is actually e5. And I think that's a move that's very, very difficult to play without preparation, because you're basically, first of all, hanging the d5 pawn, but also you're not stopping the g5 break. And so after e5, white can actually play g5, and amazingly, you're not actually taking the pawn on g5. You're actually allowing your bishop to be captured on f6. The line actually goes e takes d4, g takes f6, d takes c3, f takes g7, and rook e8. And the concept is actually that the pawn on g7 is a shield for the black king, and black actually can play in the center in the interim. And after queen takes c3, knight c5, the knight is actually coming to e4, the bishop gets to come to g4, and after a move like castles, knight e4 threatens knight takes f2, so the queen has to go back and deal with that. And after queen e1, bishop g4, I just keep making moves with threats. I'm hitting the knight on f3 now, and after bishop e2, queen f6, again, developing with threats, attacking the bishop on the knight on f3. The pawn f2 might be hanging behind it, and the material is actually, well, what's the material count? Yeah, the material is actually equal, so we both have 6, or excuse me, it's not equal. I have 6 pawns. White actually has 7, but the pawn on g7 might, be gone someday, and black is really, really active in the center of the board. And so the computer actually prefers black slightly here, but you can understand that getting to this position and allowing g5 and then g takes f6 is a tough, tough pill to swallow, especially if you, again, have done basically doing this without preparation. So, yeah, tough one to play, and a move that I really did not really strongly consider. A move I did consider was actually d takes c4, but I ultimately rejected it because, again, helping the bishop develop did not seem like a great idea, and getting the white rooks to closer to being connected, I thought was, gonna end poorly for me. I could play b5, but after a move like bishop e2, there's no really good follow-up here, and again, g5 is a serious threat, just prying open the position. And so because of that, after g4, I actually played the move g6, and my hope was that I could just dart the bishop back kind of unscathed. But I actually did think here, well, castles was played, but I actually did think here that g5 was the move that white should go for. And because even at the cost of a pawn, I thought it'd be really valuable to kind of open up these lines. And I was even wondering here if actually playing knight takes g5 and getting the bishop for the knight would be a good idea, because here the dark square bishop was also, actually adding protection to my dark squares on the king side. And so it seemed to me that for just the cost of a pawn, white was extremely active here, and this was why I thought it was a serious alternative. But fortunately for me, after g6, white actually castled, and this allowed me to transpose back to the line I should have originally gone for with g6 right away instead of knight d7, because I'm able to pop my bishop back to g7, and now, again, white can't open the center with any lever. So I thought, you know what, this has actually turned out quite decently for me. H5 and g5 aren't really a threat. Again, g5, I can go h5, and h5, I can go g5, and so I thought, you know what, I'm in good shape here. So actually, after bishop g7, white did go for g5, and trying to pry open the position, but I think it's just one move too late, because now I went h5, and I'm pretty secure here. And now I actually thought that I could initiate some play on the queen side now that my king side is fairly secure. With the kings basically on opposite sides, I have total license to kind of launch my pawns up the board and get some initiative going. In particular, because the king is still on c1, so it probably is going to need to nudge over to be more secure. And with the queen on b3, there's some ideas of me getting my pawn storm going with tempo. So I thought, you know what, this kind of is a nice thing for me to do. The other theme in the position that I thought was important was that it does seem like white has more space in the center, but in order for white to, try and get some type of winning attack or initiative, he's going to have to try and, play through the middle and advance his pawns. But as soon as he plays a move like e4 or something along those lines, he actually weakens the d4 pawn, and the entire diagonal becomes something that is sensitive and that my dark squared bishop may be able to take advantage of. So keep that in mind, that every pawn break that actually white goes for, whether it's e4 or c takes d5, they actually activate the black bishops. And I think that's kind of the catch-22 in the structure, is that white is trying to attack, but black has the forces or the cavalry to deal with it. So that's kind of an important nuance here. And so after h5, white actually played king b1, nudging the king over towards b1. It makes a lot of sense. A lot of times when you do castle queen side, you do want to put that king on the b file, because it's protecting all of the queenside pawns, whereas on c1 it's not protecting a2, so it makes sense. And after king b1, now I decided to play a5. And I thought, you know what, now's the time to kind of, begin my initiative on the queen side. And one of the things that's interesting about a5 is it actually already has a threat with a4, because you would think that knight takes a4 is a move because there are two pieces on that pawn. But after knight takes a4, I actually have d takes c4 and b5. And b5 would actually skewer two white pieces, whether it's the bishop on c4 and the knight on a4, or the queen on c4 and the knight on a4. So actually, a4 is a serious threat already, and something that's difficult to contend with. White played queen c2, just stepping out of the way of a4 coming with tempo. And I decided to play a4 anyway, because, again, I thought that if I push this a pawn up the board, create some type of weakness on the diagonal, my bishop will get some more power. And this pawn is really like a thorn pawn, basically, because, if white plays a3, then b3 is a little bit sensitive, and he creates a hook in the position for b5 and b4. But if he plays b3, then the diagonal is way, way open for my bishop on g7, and the dark squares become sensitive. So it's, I think, a tough position either way. After a4, white played the move e4, trying to play in the middle to counteract my flank initiative. And this is, consistent with chess dogma. When someone is playing on the flank, you play through the middle. The problem here, though, is that, again, black has the two bishops, and opening the position shouldn't really be to black's disadvantage with that positional trump. So I played d takes e4, really, really happy to enthusiastic to open the position, because I didn't think it was a big deal. Now, it turns out that I had an even better move than d takes e4. D takes c4 would have been even stronger. And the reason for that is because b takes c4 is kind of obligatory here, and then I can follow up with b5, and after bishop e2, bishop a6, and I'm primed and ready to go b4 and break open the white, the remaining pawns on the white queen side. Even if I'm sacking a pawn, I might go b4 and then b3 just to pry open more files for the rooks to play on. And again, now that e4 is played, the d4 pawn is sensitive, and that whole diagonal is vulnerable. And so black really has quite the initiative. Instead, I played d takes e4, and white played knight takes e4, and white does have a little bit of scope here for his knight. The d6 square might be useful, and my knight on d7 needs to kind of keep watch over the f6 square just so knight f6 doesn't land. Yeah, I thought the reason I was like d takes e4 is because I ensure that the diagonal is fully open for me no matter what. And in lines where I played d takes c4 earlier, white could consider playing pawn e5, like e4 to e5, and kind of locking up my bishop. And so I thought here my bishop is completely unopposed for the rest of the game. And because of that, after knight takes e4, I played the move a3. And this move I was quite excited about because to me it ensured that the bishop has the whole diagonal for the rest of the game. Because after b3 is played, there's no way that white can give more coverage to the d pawn with another pawn. There's no more e pawn, and the c pawn is too far advanced. And so I thought that white is super weak on the dark squares. Now, the question is how to open the position. How do I break it open and get counterplay here? Because that's important. I need to get some play going to make the position, really serious, because now it would seem that temporarily the A and B files are closed off here. And that's why I played the move queen c7. My idea with queen c7 was to get the queen off the line of the rook on d1 and also entertain the move queen f4. And I thought this square in f4 was a really sensitive square and would make a nice outpost for my queen, from which it would guard the f6 square, attack the knight on f3, and keep an eye on the center. So I thought the queen shifting over to f4 was a really nice maneuver and difficult to contend with. After queen c7, white played bishop d3, continuing his development. But I really could not see how white was going to break through to my king. The only thing that I thought was remotely dangerous is maybe there was some world where bishop takes g6 might be played as a sacrifice. And if I go f takes g6, queen takes g6, maybe he gets 2 pawns for the piece, and my remaining pawns on h5 and e6 might drop. And so the only thing I thought I might need to worry about is something like knight g3 and bishop takes g6. But it did seem remarkably far-fetched, and I thought that I had an advantage here. So after bishop d3, I actually played the move queen f4, which was in line with my plan to basically shift that queen over to the f4 square, and now actually with tempo attack the knight on f3. But actually it turns out that I had a much stronger option at my disposal, and it was actually the move c5. What I had kind of failed to notice by moving my queen off of the d file was that there weren't any more tactical opportunities because my queen wasn't hit, and now I actually pry open the diagonal, and it just is a huge problem for white, because after a move like d takes c5, I could just trade. And even knight f6 check, trying to get this bishop takes g6 idea I spoke about, it just isn't in time, because after bishop takes f6, g takes f6, I actually can get rid of the bishop with knight d3. And even here, even though I've lost one of my bishops, my other bishop is ready to pounce with e5 and bishop f5. And you could just see here that the white king is just extremely airy. And even the remaining white pawns on the king side are actually kind of weak, and they might be easy to pick off. So the position here would be close to winning for black based upon all those features. Now, the one thing that I was a little bit concerned about with c5 was the move d5. I thought that for some reason d6 might be a problem for me, like having this pawn, a passed pawn far advanced into the black camp, I thought could be a little bit annoying for me. But now I can actually play e takes d5, and after c takes d5, now go queen f4, and quite frankly, the d pawn is not enough of an asset that it's worth just opening up the entire position for the bishops. And my bishop on c8 will get some play in a moment, because after you have to defend the knight with a move like queen e2, I just have knight e5, and all of a sudden I'm activating my knights, maybe getting my queen to this diagonal, and also activating my c8 bishop. And so this position would pretty much be lost. So instead, c5 would have been way better than what I did. I went queen f4, and after queen f4, queen e2 was played. And here, I kind of was thinking, okay, my queen is on f4, great, but what's the follow-up now? Because I need to kind of get my remaining pieces activated, and I did realize now that c5 doesn't, really help so much, because it actually just, gives him a pawn. So I was trying to think about ways I could try and activate my pieces, and I landed on the move rook a5. Very, very unique maneuver, but I thought with rook a5 I had two ideas. One was to shift the rook over to f5, where I'm actually unusually attacking the knight on f3 and maybe even the pawn on f2 in some lines if the knight on e4 goes away. And the other idea was that I thought maybe I'm introducing the idea of c5 again, because that is really the key for me to open up my bishop. So I thought those were the two concepts in the position. Now, it turns out another move that is playable is actually e5. This is a move I did not consider really at all, because I thought that after d5, I'm just shutting down my bishop on this diagonal. And I thought that would just be a terrible idea. But it turns out after c takes b5, c takes d5, c takes d5, and knight b6, I still have a lot of attacking potential in this position because of knight takes d5, bishop f5, as these arrows indicate. And if that knight ever moves away from e4, I can actually play e4 and pry open the entire diagonal for my bishop. So this position is still, good chances for black. But, okay, a better move can be played after e5. White could play queen e3, trying to trade these queens off the board. And, yeah, he's successful in doing so because my queen really lacks squares. I mean, if I go queen g4, there's rook g1. So after queen e3, f e3, e d4, and e takes d4, I still have knight b6, and maybe, black is actually kind of okay here. But white has definitely weathered the storm, and I think white could be quite pleased with this position because there's no longer going to be some type of checkmating attack on the king on b1. And maybe the a3 pawn might be more of a weakness than a strength at some point if I don't get anything going. So, yeah. So probably e5 doesn't entirely work because of this queen e3 move, and then the white would be able to shift the game more towards an ending where I'm still fine, but the worst is over for white. So instead, I had my radical-looking rook a5, and yeah, I actually was really pleased with this move. I thought rook f5 was a really cool idea. And one of the points is that if you go queen e3, I go rook f5 anyway. This was kind of one of the underlying concepts, because I did see queen e3 as an idea to trade my queens. So after rook a5, white actually made a grave mistake. He should have actually played queen e3. This would have been the lesser evil, actually trying to go for a queen trade. And I was considering rook f5, but it turns out this is not the best move. Instead, a better move would have been queen c7. And the idea is to try and play c5 and rook f5 without trading the queens. And it's kind of funny because my queen was just on c7, so mentally it's very, very difficult to kind of undo an idea that you had basically been playing for and acknowledge your mistake. It's something that very, very few chess players can actually do, but this would have been the most precise way to play, and I wonder if I would have gone for it. I don't know. But instead, Mark actually played c5, and trying to shut down my rook from transferring over to f5. And this is a mistake because it actually allows me to open up more lines against the king. Now, it does seem like for the moment that the rook is, basically not getting to f5. But the problem is that after the very simple b6, I'm actually attacking this pawn multiple times, and white does not have enough on it to actually defend that pawn. And so no matter what now, lines are going to be opened. And the other issue is that if I actually do play b takes e5 and you have to play d takes e5, that bishop is just incredible. So basically, c5 actually accelerates black's opportunity to pry open lines, and that's not actually the outcome that white wanted here. So a huge mistake actually with c5. After b6, c takes b6 was played, but a better move would again actually have been queen e3 and kind of admitting that the c5 pawn is going to drop. I would probably trade queens with queen takes f3, and after f takes e3, b takes c5, and rook c1, white can try to get some counterplay on the c file based upon the fact that the c6 pawn is weak, and try and get some control in the position before I pry everything open. And this type of position, black is certainly better, and black is actually a pawn up with the two bishops, but white can still fight. The problem with what white did with Mark Dig is that after c takes b6 and knight takes b6, which I played, you actually help my knight get closer to the d5 square and to an active post where it's actually in the game, and the rook on a5 still can scuttle over to f5. So after knight takes b6, white actually played rook c1 now, challenging the c6 pawn. But one of the key features in the position is that the queens are still on the board, and my pieces are starting to converge in the middle, and so a storm cloud is brewing. I now played the move rook f5, continuing with my plan of essentially challenging the knight on f3 and getting this battery going. And I was just extremely, extremely attracted to this plan that it was kind of hard for me to reverse course or look at anything else. But it actually turns out that a stronger move would have actually been knight d5. And the point is with knight d5 that I stop this queen e3 idea, and I actually am threatening knight b4. And so the c6 pawn is actually immune. One amusing line that I think just demonstrates just how powerful knight d5 is if rook takes c6, knight b4, and rook c5, just trying to trade some pieces, I can actually take on c5, take on d3, and then play e5. And the bishops I just have like a bishop pair from hell here, pretty much. I mean, the bishop comes to f5. The other bishop is going to be on g7, is going to be screaming down this diagonal. And you really are just completely lost as white. There's just nothing that can be done to tame these bishops. So just a huge, huge problem if the lines get opened up. And so that's why rook f5 is just a little bit too mechanical. After rook f5, white does have to deal with the knight on f3, and white actually played knight g3 to challenge my rook on f5. And I'd actually seen this as a possibility because, if I play queen takes f3, there's knight takes f5. So just to illustrate that, if queen f3, it looks like I'm winning a piece, but there's actually knight takes f5 now. And the problem is I can't recapture on f5 because my queen is now hanging. And so, and then the other thing is that if I go queen takes e2, with the idea to follow up with e takes f5, white has the very important and critical intermediate move, knight e7 check. And then after the king moves, now bishop takes e2, and white is actually just an exchange up. And this position, I think, is just probably close to winning for white. So basically, I can't take that knight on f3, and my rook actually lacks squares on the f-file. So it appears all of a sudden that white may have turned the tables, because if I have to move my rook away and admit my mistake, well, maybe white has enough time to do something else. But in this position, I'd actually foreseen knight g3, and I realized that my rook was not going anywhere. And that's why I played the move knight d5. And I was extremely, extremely proud of this move because I thought this exchange sacrifice was extremely pretty. And it's actually extremely dangerous to accept. Now, it actually turns out that the best move is to accept this sacrifice, but the point is that after knight takes f5 and e takes f5, black is actually significantly better even in this structure, because the knight is now on a monster outpost on d5 where it can consider going to b4 or f4 later, and this bishop on g7 is not going to be shut down because the knight can't really I mean, it's hard to actually justify moving the knight to e5 because the d4 pawn drops. And so these bishops are getting into the game. My rook will get activated. And the problem for white is just his king is just way too naked here to really survive. I mean, the bishop is going to, really be a problem for the white king. And white does not have any easy way to trade queens either because queen e3 is stopped and queen d2 hangs the knight on f3. So basically, white has long-term play in this position, or black does. And just to illustrate what this looks like, if a move like bishop c4 is played, I can actually play knight b4, and if a move like knight e5 is played, just to try to shut down the bishop on this diagonal, queen takes d4 is just incredibly powerful. This bishop and queen work really nicely now. Again, there are mating ideas with the pawn on a3, and black has amazing comp here. So, yeah, not a position you'd want to play. So, basically, after knight d5, Mark realized here, I mean, he actually was shaking his head a little bit, and he was kind of realizing here just how powerful black's initiative is, because all of a sudden, all my pieces are converging in the middle, and there's just a massive initiative here. And the other thing that's nice about my pawns on the king side with being on light squares is they actually kind of blot out the bishop on d3. So white really does not have any attack to speak of, and this is, another tough reality of the position. So anyways, after knight d5, Mark decided to play bishop e4, which doesn't accept the exchange and temporarily holds on to the f3 knight. But unfortunately, this relinquishes some of his control of the e5 square. And it's funny because my rook on f5 is totally trapped, but I kind of want white to take it. And so I just continued onward in the middle with this move e5. And this move just blasts everything open. It's quite remarkable because you see all these pieces in this, this radius here. And it's just amazing how much energy is about to just burst into the game. I mean, it's so combustible. All my pieces here lining up so aggressively. And once this e5 pawn comes off the board and, my bishop is activated, it's just way too late. And the problem is for white now is that this bishop on c8 is actually protecting the rook on f5. So taking the rook on f5 is like suicide. And so if knight takes f5 is played, now after bishop takes f5, I'm hitting the bishop on e4, and so you have to deal with that. And if you go rook h1 to defend, I now take on d4, and I'm going to play d3 or knight c3 check, and this king is just not safe. If bishop takes f5, queen takes f5, and queen e4, I already could take the queens and go knight c3 and try to cash in and get my exchange back. But an even better move is just queen h3. And I keep the queens on the board, and I entertain knight c3 next. And there's just no way to hold everything together here for white. Black is completely winning. So it's a really tough spot now, and the position is just jumping to life. And after e5, Mark actually played queen d3. And his idea here was to actually take on f5 multiple times and not allow the bishop to actually get into the game. And also to take control of the diagonal, because in the previous variation, if he did play knight takes f5, bishop takes f5, and took on f5 again, well, after queen takes f5 check, this diagonal is not secure. And so if king a1, now I go e takes d4, and white's king is basically just done because the diagonals are just opened up. So basically, the point with queen d3 is he's trying to take control of the light square diagonal before I do. Unfortunately, the move just doesn't work, and this happens when, again, you have positions where, things are so sharp and it's just kind of gotten past your control. Black's pretty much winning regardless after e5. But queen d3 does not work just because of the calm e takes d4. And unfortunately here, after the move bishop takes f5, which Mark played, the problem is that I have this remarkable move that wins the game on the spot. So why don't you pause the video here and try to figure out what the move is here. Black to play and win. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and figure out what the move is. The move that just wins the game on the spot, and the move that Mark missed, is knight b4. And the problem for white is that this queen no longer can hold the diagonal, and so I get the massive attack that I was looking for. And so obviously the queen can't go back to c2 because the knight is hitting it, and obviously the queen on d3 is hit now. And so the question is, what is queen e4? Well, the problem for white here is that actually after bishop takes f5, the knight on g3 is actually overloaded. It's obviously protecting the queen on e4, but now it has to contend with bishop f5, skewering the queen and king. And after knight takes f5, I just have queen takes e4 with check, and I just pick up the queen, and that's it. So basically, after knight b4, the queen can't stay on the diagonal, and that means that, basically, white's king is going to burn. And so after knight b4, queen d2 was played, stepping out of the way of that diagonal. And now I can just mop up with bishop takes f5 check, knight takes f5, and queen takes f5 check. And now, again, you can see this diagonal cannot be shut down. And the knight on f3 is now unprotected, so just a world of pain. I actually thought that Mark would resign here because the remaining moves are just so natural. But Mark did play king a1, and I thought for just a moment just to find the most precise way to win, because it's quite clear here that I have all these trumps in the position, but I just want to make sure I win very cleanly, because I did feel that with the bishop on the diagonal, this pawn on a3, I should have some type of mating attack. So why don't you pause the video and try to figure out the quickest way to win here against a Grandmaster, because I think you actually can find it. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try to figure out the remaining moves. The move I started with was the move queen takes f3. And why not? You just get a second piece for the rook, and of course now I'm still threatening d3 check. And, it seems like white will need to, if they want to try anything, they should take the knight on b4. So white played queen takes b4, and now I played d3 check. And look at this king. It's just such a terrible, terrible piece right now. It's totally naked and exposed. And so the king went to b1, and now I played the move queen takes f2. And the point is now I'm threatening mate on b2, because the bishop is covering the b2 square and the pawn on a3. And so now white needs to play queen takes a3 to cover that mate. But now I can play the move queen d4. And this move just forces mate because the d3 pawn is taking away the escape square for the king on b1 to go to c2. And now queen a1 is pretty much mate on the next move. So after queen d4, Mark actually resigned. A very, very interesting game and a fun game to play. I don't get to attack like this all the time, so it was just a pleasure to be able to successfully execute an attack. But I think it really stems from the fact that the two bishops actually became extremely prominent when the center actually opened up. And it was kind of a catch-22 because when white actually... If white wanted to actually do anything to play for an advantage, he actually did need to open up the center, but it was a perilous excursion. So, yeah, I was happy to get this win. I was on 2 out of 2 in this weekend event, and hopefully was going to keep the good chess going. So, yeah, stay tuned. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.